No way it's that easy. Okay, hit the button. Bro. Bro. It's totally working. Okay, I think we're live. Can somebody check on YouTube and make sure that we're live? And that I'm not crazy.
John, Tom is here.
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you for your patience.
No problems.
So very happy to have you here. For those who do not know in the audience, this is Tom Sorrell. He's a moral philosopher, among with many other interesting things. And Tom, I want to start by having you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get right into it because I have just a million questions for you.
Oh, great. Yeah, I just want to get my camera working.
Yeah, there should be a camera icon. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat. I was a little sick yesterday. There should be a camera icon at the bottom left of your screen.
I'm just trying to get back onto. I'm trying to. Camera access is denied. Instructions for moving can be found in the Discord Help Center. Yeah, don't know.
So access denied is not something that I'm familiar with. That's very strange. I think that it might be something to do with your computer, your Discord asking your computer for permission to access its facilities. Maybe it's something in your computer settings.
Maybe.
Yeah. Usually software does
that. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. Let's just see if I can get this done, because it would be odd if I weren't on.
None of this is gonna be cut out in post. All of it will be edited out, so you don't need to worry.
No, I'm not worrying about that. I'm just worrying about being on the. Here we go. Here's something. Turn on the camera. It's in your Discord Help Center. Yeah, I'm being sent. How do I enable my mic in Chrome? I don't want to know.
Well, your mic is working just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe try your privacy or security settings on your computer, and that should hopefully help you give you Discord access.
Okay, let me see. I'm getting onto my camera. It lets. Yeah, the only thing I've got is Microsoft Teams and Zoom. Yeah, not really sure what to do.
That's very weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, so settings is only saying Microsoft Teams and Zoom, you said?
Yeah, on mine, on Apple, that's what it's saying.
Well, if you want to go through to the Discord Help Center, that's totally cool. I mean, we have a little bit of time.
Okay.
If that would make it better for you.
I'll just see what I can find.
Yeah, blitz through, and if it's still just not happening quickly, then, it is what it is.
Yeah.
But worth a go. Technology,
okay.
Right?
Start video call. Let's see. Profile start. Android. Yeah. No idea.
No, yeah, so you're hitting the camera icon. It's just saying, like, you don't have permission. Is that the idea? It's very weird. Your mic just cut out.
Yeah. Yeah. What a drag.
Yeah. So the Discord Help Center is not helping. It is not living up to its name.
It isn't. It's telling me how to make a video call, possibly. But that's not too relevant, I think.
Are you using the web version of the app?
Am I using
the web version of the app?
I think so.
Is it in your browser?
No. Yeah. It might be easier if you download the Discord app, because it will interface directly with Windows as opposed to through your browser.
Okay, well, I will try to do that.
Yeah. Go to the app store.
Because I'm registered on Discord.
Right.
Hold on.
Right.
Let's see what this is saying. This is saying message requests. Are you using the Discord web client, sir? Yeah, I don't know whether I am, but I should try to download it, yeah?
Yes. Go ahead and download it onto your computer as an app, as opposed to being something like a tab in your web browser, and that should help with connectivity a little bit.
Yep.
That's
Okay,
probably
let's
worth a
just do that.
Yeah.
Let's just do that.
If you need to log out, you can. I think you'll probably have to log out and then log back into the app.
Okay, I will do that. Let's just see what happens here. Download for Mac. I'll do that right now.
Beautiful.
And
I operate off a Mac too. Look at that.
Very good. It's just downloading now. It'll probably be fine. Come on. There we go.
No worries.
Okay, now I'll just go into apps and see what's happening.
You'll probably have to log in again, but since you already have an account, it shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah. Let's just see what happens when I click on it. Here we go. Yes, I want to open it.
Moment of truth time.
Here we go. That seems to be moving around. It seems to be doing what it's supposed to do.
I do love a good loading circle.
I know I've seen on, yeah, here we go. Starting, it says.
So are you talking to me on the web browser while you're also on the app?
I must be.
Yeah. I don't know how Discord's going to handle that.
Okay. Well,
that's kind of an experiment.
Yeah, maybe I should. So you're suggesting? Hold on. Let's see what happens here. I should just. Here's the app, and I can get rid of other stuff going on. Maybe that's what I should do.
Yeah. All you really need is the app. If things are working correctly.
Okay. Hold on then. I will just get rid of the other things and see what happens.
All right. Well, while he's gone, we're going to lay out some ground rules. My guys, no unmuting unless I say so, or I will force mute you because I am God King around here temporarily. We will be doing questions pretty similar to call-in towards the end. I'm not sure how long I have Tom for. I'm assuming it's something like an hour. So that's great. And then, within the last 15 or 10 minutes, I'll allow you guys to ask some questions. I'm not really sure how long he has. I'll ask him when he comes back. But yeah, just same rules as Colin. Don't speak unless spoken to, basically. Hopefully Tom manages to come back with an app and with his face. So all those on YouTube, this will not be in the final cut of this video, but you all get to enjoy a little, behind the scenes thing. Hey, Tom. He has returned. Yes, I see loading. That's a good sign.
Here we are.
Yeah, look at that. Tree with the clutch, absolutely clutch suggestion to go with the app. This is wonderful.
Terrific.
Okay, so this is the part where I'm probably going to start the video, so I'm going to do a tiny little intro and then we'll get started.
Great.
Yeah. So, welcome everybody. Today we are interviewing famed ethical philosopher Tom Sorrell. He is, a lot of his work covers Hobbesian ethics and philosophy regarding the strength of government, capital punishment, and then now the expanding field of ethical thought in the tech and privacy sphere. He also has interesting work on emergency ethics and even a book on scientism, which I found was kind of out of the pattern, but nonetheless unbelievably interesting. So we are going to cover all of this and more. Please, for those on stream, feel free to chat in your questions. I will be checking back on the stream temporarily every so often. But if you really want to get your word in, if you really want top priority, please join the Pangburn Discord. There should be a link in the description of this video whenever it goes up, and then you can come in and you can ask questions live to the man himself. So with that out of the way, Tom Sorrell, welcome. Thank you very much for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
So Tom, how long do I have you for, roughly, just before we start?
I think we can go for an hour and a half if you need me that long. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I'm only going to need you for like an hour, but that people like to ask questions, so I think we'll be in a good spot there. I gave them your biography a little bit, but if you want to start by telling everybody a little bit about yourself and your work, you can give a general overview, and then I'll start with my laundry list of questions.
Great. Yeah. So just to give you an overview, I've been a professional philosopher since 1978, so a long time, over 40 years, and I work on a number of different things, which I'll just list, and maybe it'll look a bit more unitary when I've done it. The first thing I've done is to work on particular moral philosophers, particular figures in the history of philosophy. So I've got a book on Descartes and other things on Descartes. I've got a book on Hobbes and other things on Hobbes. That led me also to think about what history of philosophy is and how it should be written. That's called historiography of philosophy. I'm particularly interested in how analytic philosophers do history of philosophy, since there's quite a lot in analytic philosophy that's anti-historical. That's something that I've thought about quite a bit. One of the things that I try to do is to combine the problem-solving approach of analytic philosophy with history of philosophy, sometimes using suggestions from the history of philosophy to solve problems or to address problems that are current nowadays. So there's the kind of history side of what I do. I've also been working on moral philosophy for a long time, both theoretical and applied. I have a very theoretical book quite a theoretical book called Moral Theory and Anomaly, that talks about theory versus anti-theory. And I've also got a lot of work in applied ethics, in capital punishment, in business ethics, in ethics of technology. Nowadays I work on AI ethics and other kinds of technology ethics, the kind of technology that's used in security and counterterrorism. I work on those things. And I also work as a philosopher, so to speak, in conjunction with institutions in the real world. So I'm a member of a committee that advises the Home Office in the UK. That's the Department of State that deals with internal security, the National DNA Database, and many other databases. I advise them on ethics, and I advise a couple of police forces on ethics. That's very important to the kind of work I like to do. I like to do work that affects practice and that changes institutions. So there's a bit of an introduction. I haven't talked about all the books I've written, but that gives you an idea of the spread.
It's very cool. It's a pretty wide spread. It was actually difficult trying to come up with a title for this interview. I tried to be as vague as possible. So for a lot of your work, the theme that kind of stood out to me was I mean, if I had to sum it up, and you can tell me if this is a bad theme, which is kind of how far is too far, which is regarding things like capital punishment, which is what are the limits of tech and surveillance, what ethical rules change when we're in emergency, and then kind of with your work on Hobbes, which is how strong should the government really be. The overarching question that kind of popped out to me is how far is too far. So we'll return to that question at the end of this little segment here, but the first thing I wanted to talk to you about was probably the more applied stuff. So capital punishment, for example, and this is a very interesting question for me because I am pretty divided on it personally, which is weird because I usually have pretty strong opinions on most things. So I'm curious, where do you come down on capital punishment and why? What's the what are the different factors that one should be looking at there?
Right. Well, first thing I should say is that, I worked on capital punishment primarily in the 80s, which was an interesting time to work on capital punishment. But, my position is easy to summarize. So many people think that capital punishment is kind of may work in practice to deter people, but you couldn't justify it in theory. Because there are too many objections to it. I think exactly the opposite. I think you can justify it in theory on retributivist grounds, but it's unsafe in practice for lots of different reasons. Those include access to legal help. They include discrimination in a particular jurisdiction. They include lots of different things that make it, as a practical proposition, difficult. But a lot of the philosophical literature on capital punishment tries to come up with reasons why, in principle, it's a very bad idea. And I think, in principle, it's defensible on retributivist grounds. So, the kind of approach that I've taken to it historically is to look at arguments that have been put for retributivism. And I've been interested in two types of arguments, particularly arguments from Kant and arguments from Mill. Mill was a defender of capital punishment in the UK Parliament. He was an MP for a while, as well as being a philosopher, and he argued for it in Parliament. Kant, of course, defends capital punishment as well, primarily on the ground of the necessity for an equality between crime and punishment. And he's also interested in the way that people who commit crimes are, so to speak, breaking and showing contempt for obligations they have under a social contract, and how that is an important basis for punishment, and in relation to a certain set of crimes, a basis for capital punishment. So one of the things that I tried to do in a paper that I wrote on this, I tried to say that capital punishment was justified in particular for aggravated murder, and the justification that I came up for was a kind of fusion of a Kantian and Millian position. There are difficulties with both the Kantian and the Millian justifications for capital punishment, but if you put them together, it's quite compelling, so long as you limit the kinds of crimes that are open to capital punishment.
Right.
In the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the UK, in England, you could be sentenced to death for different kinds of theft, for example.
Oh my God.
And that started the, instead of doing that, juries would send people to Australia. That's called transportation.
I think that's called option C, philosophically.
Yeah.
Capital punishment, no capital punishment, Australia.
Yeah. You can see the point of that.
Yeah. It's like, I want you permanently removed from society, but I don't want to kill you. There we go.
Exactly.
Exile.
It's like
Exile.
it was then like being sent to the moon.
Yeah, so very interesting. Do you think that those practical issues, do you think those are temporary and theoretically something that we could overcome, or do you think that the problems with application are kind of internal and baked into the cake? Because for me, one of the big reasons why I've always been hesitant about capital punishment is because it's a very permanent and irreversible punishment for a very fallible government. And to some extent, any jail time is irreversible because you have limited time, but we both understand what I'm saying. But with the rise of like DNA and technology and things like that, we can rule out 99% of doubt in some of the most extreme cases. So do you think that all of the practical problems are like that, or do you think that some of them are just kind of inherent to the practice and will never be able to be overcome?
Well, I think that some of the difficulties are probably ineradicable given the way the legal system works in in Western liberal democracies, and the way that economic power determines access to competent, sometimes legal help. Never mind excellent legal help.
Yeah.
So I think one of the problems. Error is another, of course. Even with DNA, you can there is scope for contamination and scope for errors based on analysis of DNA samples and so on. So I think the error objection is very important. But look, there are lots of people who say that capital punishment is never justified, even where it is not in dispute that a horrible crime has been committed. So, for example, in the case of the Moors murders in the UK, I don't know whether you've heard of these, but these were crimes that were committed by two very young people, a man and a woman, who, for sport, so it seems, tempted children, really quite helpless children, kidnapped them and tortured them, recorded it on tape, and were caught and sentenced after the abolition of capital punishment in England and Wales. So that seems to me to be a case of aggravated capital punishment. It's not just that somebody's murdered, but somebody's murdered and tortured. So that gives me the kind of paradigm case. The Moors murders is a kind of paradigm case of something where there isn't any difficulty over establishing that the crime took place. But yet some people think that's simply not the way that human beings should be punished.
Yeah. Hanaheim in the chat is talking about how he doesn't really believe in retributive justice, and if the goal is rehab, then obviously capital punishment is inane. I mean, I don't know if we should look at our justice system as purely rehabilitory, or purely as a deterrent. I think that there is something to be said with just giving justice to the victims and the victim's family is a good goal in itself. I mean, what do you have a position on that? Because you said it could be defensible from retributive grounds. Do you acknowledge those grounds as legit, or are you more skeptical?
Well, if we think about retribution for a little bit, let's think about cases outside capital punishment. So, for example, very often people complain. I know this certainly happens in England and Wales. People complain that some of the sentences for sexual assault, some of the sentences for rape are too lenient. And I think that there are many people who sympathize with the idea that the sentence for rape, for example, should be more severe than the sentence for car theft or something of the sort. And you cannot make out that thought without some appeal to retributivism,
Right.
You need the idea of a wrong that is greater than another kind of wrong, and you need the idea that punishment, even if you don't think that the punishment should be corporal or capital, punishment should reflect the badness of the act, so to speak. that arises across the board, even outside the area of capital punishment. And I think many people who oppose capital punishment feel these urges I'm talking about in the case of rape.
Right.
They want a more severe punishment for some crimes than they currently receive, and there they are in the grip of retributivist ways of thinking.
Yeah, and I think that that's a deep-seated animalistic instinct, of course, but I don't think that's all it is. I don't think that you can dumb down retributive. I'm butchering it, but I don't think you can dumb down that idea as like, just a base instinct that's counterproductive. I think that there's a real reason that exists. Last question on this one, because I have a lot to cover, which is, do you think something like, this is an idea that I've had because I'm a pretty legally minded guy, it would be pretty like radical, will never happen, but for crimes where capital punishment is on the table, the burden of proof increases from beyond a reasonable doubt to beyond a shadow of a doubt or something like that. Do you think that would fix the application problems, or do you think the same problems would still sit there? The same problems with representation, the same problems with error. Do you think it would still just be inescapable?
Well, I mean, I think that it would probably, by raising the burden of proof, you probably reduce, the scope that juries have for any kind of conviction under a capital statute. So it could be that you keep capital crimes on the statute, but I think beyond a shadow of a doubt is super, super, super high threshold. So I think that would be tantamount to abolition, except in countries where juries are very arrogant or judges decide or something like that.
Sure. You're right. It'd probably fix the problem by making sure there was never a conviction at all. Yeah, as you said. Okay, so another corner of this how far is too far question. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about emergency ethics next, because it's something we've dealt with a lot recently, so I'm sure you've had a heyday with that. And the question basically comes down to, what is the limiting principle for governmental action in normal circumstances, and then why does it change, and how much does it change when we're in a state of emergency? And there's a million other questions around that, but we'll just start there.
Yeah. Well, it's a big subject, so we can talk about different kinds of emergencies, and there are various different considerations that arise in relation to several. So, for example, if you have a weather emergency, that's going to permit some things that maybe a kind of terrorist emergency might not permit, or would be more controversial to permit them. There are all kinds of emergencies. The thing about emergency is there are a couple of things that are important to emergency. An emergency is a situation where you have to act, and act quickly, in order to eliminate or minimize a very significant harm. If you don't meet those conditions, it's not an emergency. So there's the idea of an imminent, very large harm that you have very short period of time to address. That's already very constraining. And because you've got this very short you've got this very short period of action, that is one of the things that loosens the usual constraints on action. So, for example, this is an example that comes from one of the papers I've written on emergency. But suppose that you're with your father, and he has a heart attack, and you're walking along the road, and you've got to get him to a hospital. You can't summon an ambulance really quickly. So what you do is you break into a car. You jump start the car, and you drive away to the hospital. Now, normally you're not supposed to break into cars and jump start the cars, but you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to do things that are normally wrong, because what you're trying to do is save a life, and saving a life trumps not breaking into cars if one is a means of doing the other, if you see what I mean.
Especially if you plan to return the car. If you never return the car, you might be in trouble.
Yeah.
After the fact, yeah.
But and similarly, if you're on the point of starvation and you're out in the woods somewhere, and somebody's got a cabin with some food in it, you would be permitted, it seems to me, to break in and feed yourself, because otherwise you'll starve to death. Even though normally it's not a good idea and wrong to break into to places. So those are examples of how emergency weakens constraints. If we contrast the case of, say, a weather emergency like wildfires or floods, if you contrast those cases with a perceived terrorist emergency, then things become a little bit more cloudy, because the definition of terrorism is more controversial, and the means of identifying terrorists are subject to error in a lot of different ways. And because some of the actual policies that have been developed, both in the US and the UK, for identifying and trying to prevent terrorism are extremely intrusive on an absolutely gigantic scale. So I'm just contrasting those two types of emergencies.
Sure.
You might say that if billions or trillions of pieces of information have to be collected from innocent citizens in order to bring 60 potential ISIS members, to bring charges against 60 charges that are not even leading to conviction, then there's a kind of disproportion between the means used and the results achieved. And there's a kind of confusion perhaps about what the right way of capturing terrorists is. This is what Edward Snowden was complaining about.
Right.
So I'm just to give you the kind of headlines.
Yeah.
If you contrast the two cases, you get a sense of a place where emergency doesn't really give you license, because terrorism is more controversial about both means and ends, and the weather emergencies where you do get the license because one understands why the means adopted could be means that are normally wrong but permissible in the case of emergency.
Right. And in the case of like natural disaster emergencies, the threat that the government is saying justifies the thing is a non-political threat. It's objective, like the wind is going to hit your house. Well, there's other emergencies that are more debatable in multiple ways, like the terrorism. So I'm agreed that these are the types of limits, right? That on one end you have, starving man raised pantry for food, and on the other end you have trillions of bits of data for one terrorist charge. And one is justified and one is not. So here's the $1 trillion question that I know is not fair to ask you at all. Where in between those things is the line? How can we articulate the limiting principle there? What makes the difference?
Well, you can't. I mean, there isn't a completely general principle that you can articulate, because the types of emergencies are so different. But I think what one can do is one can reflect, for example, on the prevention of emergency. This too is subject to a lot of confusion. But what a lot of liberal democratic states try to do is to work out in normal times the kinds of emergency measures that could be adopted in emergencies.
Right.
So they come up with constraints that if you were in an emergency, you could legitimately resort to, and there are norms worked out at the level of international law, and also norms that are worked out in relation to domestic law for the kinds of measures you can take, and to prevent some of the excesses that there could be, say, in a program of counterterrorism. There's also the idea that emergency legislation should be subject to sunset clauses. So you have emergency powers for, say, 2 weeks, and then you need a parliament or some other democratic body to give you a renewal of those emergency powers. those are ways of trying to to remedy in advance the excesses that emergencies sometimes invite you.
Right.
And of course, you have drills and um, kind of role playing and these large exercises where you try to see in real time what these kinds of things would pan out like. I've been involved in some of these exercises. They're really elaborate and difficult to do.
But they prevent anything getting out of hand. They prevent runaway fear, right? Because like, oh, everybody do something. It's more okay. Now we do this thing that we set out 10 years ago. Yeah.
Well, it's also coordination of a lot of different people. You know, in the case of a large scale emergency, as we've seen in the case of the pandemic, there are loads and loads of agencies that you have to get working in harmony, and that's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
So and sometimes the emergency kills the people in those agencies.
Yeah, that's a real wrench in the works, I imagine. So last question on this is, do you think that there are any excesses or any lines that should never be crossed regardless of the emergency? Do you think there's any hard lines that the government should never go outside of? Or do you think, depending on the emergency, basically anything could be permissible?
Well, no. I mean, I don't think that anything is permissible, but I think that the sort of real limits on state action are set by loss of life. In the case of emergency, because of the way that significant harm is what's at stake, you need a kind of hierarchy of harms to guide you.
So it's
If
somewhat
what we're talking
utilitarian.
about, sorry.
So it's somewhat utilitarian, if I'm understanding.
Well, I don't think it's entirely utilitarian. For example, a contractualist, the kind of theory that's been worked out by Tim Scanlon, would also allow for harm to weigh. But so it's not entirely utilitarian. It could be utilitarian, but the issue here is, in the case of most emergencies that are dealt with by governments, the thing that one is trying to limit is the loss of human life. And below the loss of human life, one tries to limit incapacitation, and so on. This corresponds to different kinds of harm that affect the life course of people. And that's really what's super important in liberal democratic theory. So that seems to me to be crucial. But other people would want to say further things need to be taken into account, like maybe the state of the environment as a result of emergency action, or the state of politics, or the state of democracy, or something of the sort. But in the kind of theory that I've tried to argue for, which has important elements from Hobbes, the loss of life is extremely important, and it's very distinctive of a Hobbesian approach to things that very few things trump loss of life.
Sure.
Like there's some things where you feel if I can't have X, or if I can't live in an X way, I don't want to live anymore, so I'm willing to die in that kind of situation. That's fundamentalism, and that's not something Hobbes has any sympathy for.
No,
and I think that's
he does not.
broadly correct.
I think it's correct in a lot of ways. I do think that there's some conditions one can be in that are so objectionable in terms of dignity. But I think there's a conversation there. But so here's a question then. I'm going to give you a little bit of a trolley problem here, which is so let's say you have an emergency the government is trying to stop. Let's say in the abstract, let's throw out like the UN's like plans or the like. And essentially, this emergency is going to kill 1,000,001 persons. This natural disaster emergency, this meteor. But in order to prevent it, the government could kill 1 million itself and save a life. Now, I realize this is completely implausible. I get that, but it's a thought experiment. Would that be okay? And so to give you my answer real quick, my answer is no, because while it does save one life, the one life does not justify the active and conscious violations of the right to life that the government is engaging in, while the 1,000,001 are being killed by a natural disaster that's not like actively being done by the government. That would be my first blush instinct. I'm kind of curious where you come down on this, because the right to life is very important, but I also feel that maybe the government should go around killing people itself. So I'm curious what you think on this one, and then we'll move on.
Well, I think that my instincts are a little bit more utilitarian, perhaps. If every life has quite a lot of value, then there are going to be cases where the government will have to tolerate the sacrifice of some lives for the sake of more life saving, where there's a tension. I mean, there are many cases like this. When you're talking about the distribution of emergency response resources, for example, if you're in a position where, for example, the same resources are available for a pretty good emergency response in a large city, and maybe an even better response in a very sparsely populated rural community, and the effect of sending it to the rural community is that a whole city's worth of people are lost.
Right.
The relative value of lives taken one by one favors the city.
Yeah.
It's not that the government has to be cavalier about the lives lost in the rural area, but it's that they're dealing with the same basis of complaint from everybody,
Sure.
namely, save me, don't sacrifice me, and they have to
Do it.
Yeah. You get
So in your example, it's save this group or save this group, and for the other group, let nature take its course. Do you see this as the same as saying save this group by actively killing this group? So you can imagine the military.
No.
Okay, so it's not the same.
No.
Not the same. Okay, I was curious about that.
No, it's
You
not
can
the same.
imagine
I
a
mean,
horrific plague scenario or something, right? Where you got to kill everybody. But I know that some utilitarians who I've talked to see no difference between those two things. They're like,
Yeah,
you're letting
I know.
them die, but you do. So why is there a difference? I agree. I think there's a difference too, but I'm bad at articulating it. So yeah.
I think there's an issue. There's some pretty esoteric considerations about the relationship of omissions to commissions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that to describe what is happening when one decides to send the resources to the city instead of sending them to the rural area, one's not saying let nature take its course. One's saying that the agent recognizes the claims of each person who's going to lose a life on these resources that have to be distributed, and it simply counts the lives that would be saved and says, well, if there's a greater amount of life saving, that's that gives everybody the same basis for assessing what's done. But it's not saying let nature take its course. It's saying, look, we would like to help you. If we could find a different way of distributing the available resources, we would. We accept that you have a claim on these resources. All of that is said. So it's not just saying flip a coin.
Sure.
It's not just saying we don't have any obligations to you folks because the city's so much bigger. It's acknowledging those claims. It just says that those claims are not strong enough when the measure of justification for sending resources is life-saving.
Right. Remind me to move to a city in the near future.
Are you? Choose it carefully.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think there's a certain pretty big trade-off there. Sure, certainly. City's a bad place for a zombie apocalypse, for example. But the last thing I wanted to talk to you about before we get into scientism is the technology and privacy idea. So there's this is something we talk about on the Pangburn Discord server quite a bit, which is basically, who cares if the government can see like your spicy messages or whatever. If you're saving lives through the prevention of criminal action, either directly or indirectly, through the policy that allows the government to see that, then you have a moral obligation to give up your privacy. Because, again, who cares if they can see your selfies? It's not important. On a purely utilitarian level. Now, I don't think in a purely utilitarian way, but it's a very strong argument to me, and we've just been talking about how important saving lives are. So I'm curious where you are on this. Do you think that's too far? And if so, why? And if so, why not? And if not, why not?
Well, again, there are lots of different types of emergencies here that have a bearing on privacy. So, and there are also quite a lot of facts about the kind of data that's taken from people and that is considered a privacy violation. Mm-hmm. In the case of the program that Edward Snowden objected to, it isn't true that people were taking racy messages between folks.
Yeah.
What they were doing,
metadata.
First of all, it wasn't humans doing it; it was computers doing it. What they were doing was telephone chaining. So they were working from people who were either known terrorists or people of interest, and looking at their communications data, and they were trying to say, okay, here's somebody that we know is involved in terrorism. Who are they communicating with? And then they would have hypotheses that if there's intense communication between somebody in this network and somebody else, that justifies further investigation. But the kind of investigation that was done was investigation of metadata, like what telephone number got in touch with what other telephone number. And it was only when further information of that kind suggested offenses or culpability that content was looked at. That is not metadata, but the actual content of messages. And there are also restrictions in America on whether it was a U.S. person who was involved in these communication networks or a non-U.S. person. So there have always been these kinds of discriminations about between metadata and content, and between different people involved and what their citizenship is. But now, I myself think that the collection of my metadata, even though it is a basis for inference about things in my life, the collection of metadata is not very intrusive, especially when it is the collection of metadata by a computer, and there are millions of pieces of data mining going on all the time. In other words, even if something about me was picked up by an algorithm as being sort of shady, it's very, very unlikely that would ever get to the stage of being investigated because of the huge amounts of information overload that this approach to counterterrorism involves. It's the most cockamamie way of, trying to identify people. What people used to say in the NSA, in the National Security Agency, was something like this: we know that finding a terrorist is like finding a needle in a haystack. But hey, when a terrorist event happens, we'll have the whole haystack. Mm. And that idea is just nuts as a practical proposition for finding terrorists. So I think that's going to form an objection to this program, even though, in my opinion, the intrusion involved is minimal. So I myself think that intrusion in that case was minimal, but that there were other important problems with the NSA program. For example, the extent to which legislators were told what was going on and had sufficient control over it. That's one thing. But now let's look at another case where things are very different. If we look at the way that South Korea responded to the pandemic at the very, very beginning of the pandemic, when there were a number of cases in South Korea involving people who had traveled from Wuhan to South Korea. And what the South Koreans did, they had a very, very aggressive testing program for people who showed symptoms. And then for all of those people who were established to have got the virus, they did tremendous amounts of fusion of data sets to find out whom they might have been interacting with. So they looked at the ATM activities of these people. They looked at their communications data. They looked at the location data of their telephones, and they came up with a picture of where these people had been. And then, without asking for anybody's permission, they sent email messages to people in the localities that those folks had traveled through, and warned them that they had been possibly exposed to people who were carriers of the virus. The result of that very intrusive policy was an almost lightning fast reduction in cases of the virus in South Korea. Now, I think that's an absolutely fine sacrifice for the sake of saving lives. I think the value of privacy in the case of a pandemic, which takes hundreds of thousands of lives, is vastly exaggerated. So there's a case where you've got very little time before the outbreak gets out of control, and you've got in South Korea the capacity of mining data sets, not for the hell of it, not to find out what racy messages people are sending, but to save lives. It's a no-brainer to me that that's more important than violations of privacy, even though violations of privacy in normal times are bad things.
So, I think the follow-up, the common thread I see between the difference, I think, between the NSA thing and the South Korean thing, and even the difference between the South Korean version of COVID response and some of the more objectionable U.S. versions, is narrowness of scope, right? Because with the South Korean version, they find people who have been confirmed to have the virus, and then they have people around them who they think might have the virus, and it's very targeted. But in the case of NSA, they are dealing with everybody's metadata to some extent. I know they do phone chain stuff, and if that's all they did, I don't think I would care. But it seems like they're doing it for not just people connected to terrorists. And for the U.S.'s version of COVID things, it wasn't exactly laser targeted. It was very kind of shotgun style. And I think that's what kind of makes people object. Do you think that those objections are warranted? And also, do you think that the shotgun style is escapable, or do you think it's necessary sometimes?
Well, I think it varies with the emergency. Sure. In the case of COVID, where there is there's a short period in which people can look at the rate of infection and try to do something about it. Otherwise, it starts to go completely out of control. Some of these measures that were tried in South Korea look quite justifiable. But if you contrast what was done in South Korea with what was done in the UK and in Western Europe, in the UK and Western Europe, there was an enormous amount of emphasis on privacy protecting track and trace systems, which made them extremely ineffective and extremely unreliable.
I'd imagine.
for lots of reasons, which I can go into if you want to. But it just strikes me that looking at the way that the UK app or the Western European apps were developed and the results of developing them in a privacy protecting way, and looking at what happened in South Korea, they're very instructive cases for the effects of not taking urgency seriously.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if part of it is a level of trust in the government that may exist in South Korea that might not exist in the more Western parts of the world. I don't know. I suppose that I would be a lot more comfortable with something like that happening to me if I liked my government a little bit more. So there's also that side of things.
Yeah.
But I suppose the question is it's less of, I think the theme that we're stumbling onto here is that it's less about the invasion of privacy and it's more about the targetedness of the privacy invasion. And that's because the South Korea major privacy intervention, but also we knew these people specifically were at risk. Like in cases like Sweden, they kept you in your house or they violated, you could consider that a right, but only for people who are old, who are actually at risk, and who are significantly at risk of dying, stuff like that. While America was like locked down everybody all the time. And that's not to comment on the efficacy of either one. That's not what I'm talking about right now. There's arguments for both sides. What I'm talking about is what sparked the large objection reaction from the population. And it feels to me that it's less about privacy invasion and less about rights violation and more about the targetedness of the program, because if people feel that they are being swept along with this policy unnecessarily, they're going to be a lot more ruffled. Do you think that's a fair theme to draw out there?
Well, of course, it's perfectly reasonable to have objections along those lines. I think there are many different things going on here. One is a cultural difference. Okay.
Yeah.
There is a big cultural difference between the U.S. and Western Europe, for example.
True.
One of the bases of that cultural difference is that a lot of America, and in particular the tech community in America, is very libertarian. Now, in the UK, that's not the case. In the UK, people think that state institutions, especially the health service, are very important for realizing rights and protecting rights. People do not think of state interventions as a kind of incipient tyranny, as they sometimes seem to do in America.
Yeah.
And they do not think of the health service as a kind of communist conspiracy. It's a different way of thinking about the state, and of course that has a big claim on what's makes a big difference to what's going on here.
Yeah.
It's not that you have to trust, the state in a kind of supine way, as if nothing the state can do is going to hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody has to think that. But I think one has to distinguish between cases and cases. There are cases where there's a small window of opportunity to get something done, and a small range of means that, if they're tried, have a chance of working. And if the background feelings about the operations of the state are very distrustful to the point where it might look to outsiders, at least, like paranoia, then I think you get a different angle on things. So there might be more resistance in America based on a lot of background beliefs and inclinations that folks have politically than there would be in the UK. But even in the UK, I thought there was much too much deference to privacy protections relative to other things the population thought. I don't think anyone, for example, the National Health Service in the UK holds gazillions of pieces of data about people's health. Gazillions. It's one of the most precious data sets in the world. For medicine, for the medicine globally, that data set of all the patients for generations in the UK, that's fantastic research asset. Nobody minds the NHS holding all that data. It is a branch of the state, but nobody minds. It's not regarded as sinister. So maybe it should be regarded as sinister, but it isn't. And I think that's at the bottom of a lot of what's going on. A lot of the different attitudes that are involved here.
Well, America has always been more skeptical of its government, so you're not wrong there that has a large impact. I think recently there's been a breakdown in institutional trust. I think there's been a breakdown in social cohesion and social fabric. That's all contributing, but none of which applies to South Korea, for example. So I think that's all. I tend to agree.
We shouldn't overdo the kind of social difference of people in South Korea. They've had quite a few problems themselves in the past. But there are differences.
Yeah,
there are differences.
Just not to the same extent. I'm not an expert on South Korean culture, and I don't want to pretend to be. So I think the last thing I want to talk to you about before we get to some questions, although all of these rabbit holes, believe me, I'm killing myself stopping the thread on each one, but I want to get to everything, is scientism. So I hear this term a lot in the American right. The American right thinks about scientism as essentially science pathologized into a type of religion or a type of faith, characterized by inordinate trust in scientific institutions, rather than the scientific process itself. Which, I mean, I don't know. I think that there's something there, but there's something there. So I'm curious, when you say scientism, do you mean the same thing? And if so, why? And if not, what do you mean?
Well, the book I wrote on scientism was published in the early 1990s, and that is a book about the attitude of analytic philosophers to science.
Totally different. Okay.
Totally different, but
still interesting.
There are some common elements. So, when I wrote that book, I was interested in the attitudes of some American philosophers, including very famous American philosophers, Quine, for example, to science. It's as if the attempt to distinguish philosophy from science was, for Quine, always suspect. The idea of a first philosophy insulated from evidence and insulated from science, the idea that there were any, sentences that were totally hived off from empirical ones in a certain sense. All of that kind of skepticism is the sort of thing that I was against. There's a similar tendency, to try to explain everything using evolutionary theory, and similar tendencies.
You can.
So I think
you can get a pretty good shot at trying to explain everything evolutionarily, though. You could take that thread pretty far. So
yes, you can. You can take it. You can take it pretty far. That's true, and people do try to take it very far. But there's a reputable pushback against that kind of thing in certain philosophers. For example, there's a reputable push against that from Tom Nagel, and there's a reputable push against that from other philosophers. I think here again, there's a kind of culture difference between Anglo philosophy and American philosophy on this particular issue. For example, I think in America, there's a wish to kind of naturalize everything. There's a wish to naturalize mathematics. There's a wish to naturalize ethics. there's a wish to naturalize metaphysics in the sense of not recognizing anything in one's ontology except those things that are already recognized by the natural sciences. So you can have everything from subatomic particles to what subatomic particles compose, all of that's fine, but you cannot have abstract entities like numbers or shapes, and ethics is sort of reduced naturalistically through non-cognitivism, through the idea that ethics is all to do with sort of standard reactions, emotional reactions of people to different situations. Those kinds of tendencies are bad for ethics and bad for the philosophy of mathematics, I think, and perhaps also bad for other parts of philosophy of science. But that's a different kind of problem from the problem of scientism in society more generally.
Sure.
Where people say that if scientists think a thing, then everyone else has to think it too. I think there are certain cases where that's so, and other cases where it's not so.
Sure. Very interesting. Yeah. So, would you say that? How do I put this? If you are objecting to the idea that ethics can be boiled down in some sense to just emotions or cognitive behaviors on the part of humanity, is that taking the position that ethics are kind of outside of humans, that they're somewhat not purely subjective? Is that how I should be reading it? Because
yes,
basically it's kind of the thought problem, right? A little bit.
If you look at people like philosophers like Scanlon, like Nagel, probably the metaphysics that goes with Parfit, all of these folks think that there's something in the reasons that people invoke in ethics, that is, reasons for action that make an action into a moral action, acting for certain reasons that make what you're doing something that's right or wrong. They take the reasons involved there to have some objective kind of validity. And the kinds of reasons we're talking about are not necessarily very esoteric. If you say that somebody does somebody harm, that's an objective reason for not doing the thing, even if it's not a decisive reason for not doing a thing. It's always a substantial reason for not doing a thing.
Sure.
Incapacitation is the same sort of idea. Those reasons have an objectivity that doesn't depend on a lot of people's emotional reaction to them.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think that squares away what you meant by scientism. So Peter, yeah, accident. It's okay. Okay, so for the last 10, 20 minutes here, 20 minutes tops, I would love to be taking any questions anybody has for Mr. Sorrell. I think it's been a very interesting conversation. If there are no questions live from our 4-person audience, soon to grow when this is a video, I will ask some questions that were from the chat. But for now, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Sri.
So, I was really interested in your take on Edward Snowden. What was revealed about the metadata, particularly because the way you described it, it's not quite right. I'm just wondering if you're able to establish the ethics of using an AI system, given that you think that metadata isn't enough to cause harm, because as someone who's broken into security systems, electronic security systems, and has built AIs, I think I could do a fair amount of harm just using metadata. And the other aspect of this is as well, it's not just metadata they were capturing. They tapped into the Google Fiber connection between data centers. And that metadata is like every Gmail request, everything in your Google Docs was fully unencrypted. That's way more than just who you called. And I can already do a lot of damage with that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, I was just talking about this particular program that was concerned with telephone chaining. There are other kinds of communications data that were looked at as well. And I wasn't saying, that metadata could do no harm. On the contrary, I agree with you that using metadata, you can do harm. I was saying that metadata is less intrusive. It was a privacy claim. It's less intrusive than the content of, say, email messages or what have you. So the claim that I was making there was only distinguishing metadata from content with respect to the amount of intrusion that was involved in bulk collection. That's all. And the other thing that I was saying, which I think bears on what you're talking about, is the way the NSA was operating, right? Even for communications data sets that weren't for telephones, and calls between people, what was happening was that queries were being made on these data sets in such numbers that even if something interesting was disclosed, there was so much information being passed to analysts that it was kind of self-defeating. Those were the 2 points I was making. So one was just a small point about intrusion, the relative intrusion of metadata, not the harm that could be done on the basis of metadata. And the other point was just that it was self-defeating for a lot of reasons, but mainly because of information overload.
I have another question for you here from the chat, and then Tree, if you have another one, you can ask it in a second. But somebody in the chat was taking real issue with the idea of justice as a retribution because this person does not believe in the existence of free will. Yeah, that's, I think that this is kind of a bad argument because at that point you just kind of have to throw out the justice system on an abstract level at all. But it feels that way to me. But I'm curious, do you think free will is a thing? That's the most precise way I can put it. And how do you respond to that objection that retributive punishment is insane in a world without free will and serves no purpose?
Well, I think that, the position that you've just outlined is fair enough in certain cases. There may be cases where, the kinds of forces that have operated in the development of a personality are so, damaging that, the volition of people and the actions of people are undercut. The agency of people is undercut.
This person doesn't believe in agency at all. Like, it doesn't exist at... This person doesn't believe in the existence of agency.
I know.
Okay,
I'm saying where I agree is that there may be certain people who have no free will in the sense that their agency has been undercut by a lot of external forces. In general, though, I do think that there's free will in the sense that, attributions of intention and so on can be true, and that attributions of responsibility can be true. So that doesn't mean that you can't cache attributions of intention and attributions of responsibility in a way that's broadly consistent with physicalism, but I'm not sure whether that's the issue that's driving this denial of free will on the part of your your participant. So
Sure.
I don't say everybody's got free will or something like that, but my in general, I'm inclined to say that attributions of responsibility and intention can be true, which means that there is intention and there is responsibility.
So I'm inclined to agree, and I do agree with that, but that's because I kind of go outside materialist, purely physical reality to do that. How do you believe in true attributions of intention in a material universe governed ultimately by cause and effect, ultimately a massive web of falling dominoes? If you're purely, physicalist, how do you square that idea of agency for some people?
This is where you get help from Davidson. Davidson has a way of talking about actions as a special case of events, including intentional actions. As soon as you've got the action and event ontology going, where actions are a special case of an event, you can do some of these identifications between physical events and mental events, or have descriptions, action descriptions, and event descriptions that are co-referential, or true at the same time, maybe. That kind of apparatus enables you to have a kind of compatibilist rendering of actions within a causal nexus. That's a well-known. I don't know whether you may not be too familiar with Davidson. I don't know, but that's what I would do.
I'm not familiar, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, Donald Davidson is a very good philosopher.
Yeah.
Dead now, of course. But
I have all the good ones are, except for you, I suppose. No, it's good because I defend free will on the regular, so one more tool in the kit is great. Mostly on like practical grounds. Mostly like, do you understand the implications that we would have to impose on our society, like if we were going to be consistent about this idea? And the answer is pretty drastic changes to my mind. Okay, we have time for one more question. If anybody wants to ask one, they can, or if not, I'm gonna bid good day to Mr. Sorrell. Looks like Tree wants to get one more word in.
Sure.
Tree, hold on. I'm going to let you ask a question. However, I want anybody else in the chat who has not gotten a chance to get priority. So you have 5 seconds to steal Tree's turn, and if you don't, Tree's gonna take it. Okay, Tree, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the challenges involved in intelligence work is identifying people that are vulnerable to persuasion, right? In order to manipulate them into giving you intel, right? It doesn't necessarily mean they've done anything wrong, right? It just means that they're in a position of power to get you what is in your country's national interest. Mm-hmm. Obviously, national interest is a vague idea, just like terrorist. But whatever happens, whatever the secret organization decides they're going to do and what's important is obviously has to be in national interest, because otherwise why would they do it? My question is, say if you're trying to determine the difference between someone who has power and vulnerabilities in over somebody that you want to target, right, versus somebody who does not, right? How do you do that in a way that respects privacy? Because you're going to have to identify like data that does not match your criteria, as well as data that does match your criteria, so your AI can figure out the difference.
Yeah. I think that in practice, from the information that I have from folks in intelligence services that I know, one could distinguish, say, by monitoring a Telegram channel or something similar, you can identify through basically eavesdropping on these channels folks who are possibly vulnerable. You can do it in other areas like prisons where one knows that there's recruitment of these of people to terrorism, one can do it on social media channels that one knows are already being used in different parts of Europe for people who joined ISIS, say. So I think there's quite a lot of profiling of people who are vulnerable, partly by age, partly by social class, partly by neighborhoods that they live in different European cities. There are lots of ways of doing that complement maybe a less crude whole haystack approach to the collection of data by an algorithm. And I guess what I'm saying is not that it has no place. The use of algorithms on communications data. Of course, it has some place. Monitoring communications with any phone number in Syria is potentially interesting. Monitoring communications with any phone number in Chechnya is interesting, and similarly for some places in sub-Saharan Africa. All of that is potentially interesting to an intelligence service. But you don't want to approach this with a single tool, is what I'm saying. So maybe that means that we're not in terrible disagreement. I don't know, but that's how I would tease out the extra techniques that you could use for distinguishing the vulnerable from other people.
Well, it seems to dovetail very well with the principle earlier of just be as focused and specific as possible when you're going to, be intruding in any way. And I think that's probably a good rule of thumb. Mr. Tom Sorrell, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. It's a great conversation. I'll be sure to video should be up in a week or so. It's going to be great. So thank you for being here. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Yay, successful stream.